What do you know about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? What foods do patients have to avoid? Do you think carbs or dietary fat affects the liver more? Are there any liver superfoods that support liver function? Should patients do a liver cleanse? We're covering all these questions and more today on the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast. My name is Colleen. I'm a pediatric PA and registered dietitian, and each week I'm giving you the nutrition training you never got in school to help you guide your patients with compassion and confidence. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the term for a range of conditions caused by buildup of fat in the liver. It's usually seen in people who are overweight or obese and sometimes comes with comorbidities like type 2 diabetes. Early stage NAFLD does not usually cause any harm, but it can lead to serious liver damage, including cirrhosis. So guiding your patients to follow a healthy diet and modest weight loss is essential. So to help me unpack this topic, I'm thrilled to introduce you to another PA-RD, Cassidy Mccandless. She has been a registered dietitian for 4 years before pursuing the PA profession for a deeper scope of practice. She now works in motility, gastroenterology, and general hepatology at a tertiary care center. She loves all things GI and being able to use both degrees at the same time to guide her patients on their health journey. Cassidy, thank you so much for being here with me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
All right. I think it's so important to get our terms straight because for those of us who aren't in GI, we might have forgotten some of these acronyms. And this is an important differentiation when we're talking about fatty liver. So what is the difference between NAFL and NASH?
Yeah. So there's a spectrum of disease within non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD. The first of which being NAFL, or non-alcoholic fatty liver. And that is simply having fat in the liver. From there, it is possible for some people for that to progress to NASH or NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. But from there, there's further progression, fibrosis or scarring of the liver, cirrhosis, and then potentially even liver cancer or hepatocellular carcinoma being the most common. So this is a giant umbrella under non-alcoholic fatty liver disease of multiple spectrums of disease.
Are these diseases preventable?
Yeah, they are incredibly preventable with mostly lifestyle changes. There's been a handful of medications on the market over time for the treatment of these diseases, but none have really stuck. So when we have patients who we're concerned have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, whether that's NASL or NASH, we're going to be promoting different lifestyle changes. They're also fairly associated with different metabolic diseases. So think back to metabolic syndrome, people who have high blood pressure and diabetes, as well as elevated triglycerides. These patients or these people are more likely to have fatty liver disease. So we want to target the root cause as well. Different lifestyle changes that we're going to recommend would be typically things like modest weight loss, with about 5 to 10% of their weight. There's also specific modifications that we recommend, such as lowering the amount of high fructose corn syrup specifically in a patient's diet. There are some interesting studies on vitamin E supplementation that are just in their infancy, as well as studies that we have with great information of observation, but not necessarily correlation. So one would be, lucky for all of us, that coffee may prevent the fibrosis or scarring of the liver in patients who have even non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is different from non-alcoholic fatty liver in that in NASH, there's inflammation. And that's how it can eventually lead to the scarring of the liver. So the good news is that coffee could be helpful. The bad news is a lot of those studies use black coffee, not lattes or macchiatos or, the Folgers creamer.
Oh my gosh, I love when literature supports coffee because if you listen to my podcast for any amount of time, you know I love coffee and I am in full support of any research article that supports it and proves its health benefits. So I love that. Now, I definitely want to get into the specifics of foods, and I love that you gave us kind of that general overview because this sounds like primary care providers could be addressing some of these issues, especially if we're just starting out with lifestyle changes. And so this is an important thing for all my primary care clinicians to be paying attention to. But I would love for you to start us off with reminding us of kind of back in school with the fat metabolism that's going on in the liver and the gallbladder and why this is happening to individuals.
Yeah. So, from the moment that we eat fat, whether it is what people think of as a healthy fat, like unsaturated fats, or unhealthy fat, I don't know, my air quotes are going for people who are listening because, there's no such thing as good or bad food. But no matter what the source of fat is, when we eat it, we're going to be breaking that down. So our pancreas will be releasing lipase, but then our liver creates bile salts, which are stored in the gallbladder. And so during digestion, those bile salts are released to break down fat into smaller pieces or emulsify it in a way that it can be absorbed into the small intestine. So we have multiple GI organs from the pancreas, the gallbladder, the liver, all involved with this breakdown of fat itself. From there, the liver is truly amazing, right? So the liver is our storage tank for fat-soluble vitamins, like vitamins A, D, E, and K. The liver also is involved with creating fat, so the process of lipogenesis. So when we eat foods that are high, usually especially in carbohydrates, because there's carbohydrates all around, so things like sodas or chips, things like that, our body can take those carbohydrates, break them down, and turn them into fat through the process of lipogenesis, which is primarily occurring within the liver. Because of all this great metabolism within the liver can store fat. Extra fat can end up in the liver. We talked about, the spectrum of disease. So having non-alcoholic fatty liver, just having fat in the liver. It's not really doing a lot. It's just there. Because there's no screening guidelines for the diseases within non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a lot of times it's just going to be incidentally found on a scan. It might say hepatic steatosis. No information. It's left to primary care providers to work that up, figure out, is it simply non-alcoholic fatty liver? Is it something else like Wilson's or related to medication? Is it the progression of non-alcoholic fatty liver to NASH, to fibrosis, to cirrhosis, hepatocellular carcinoma, things like that?
Such a helpful overview and a reminder, because these are things that we've only been taught and thought about in school, and only individuals like you who are in GI actually focus on and read about and think about every day. So I'm really grateful for that overview. And now I'm super excited to get into the specifics of nutrition, because I love your background being a dietitian, now a PA, just like me. So let's get into those specifics. And you briefly mentioned on a few of them, but I really want you to give our primary care clinicians just some foods that patients should be eating, because they're going to come and ask those specific questions. What can I eat? What can't I eat? So let's differentiate between the two and start out by telling us, what foods should patients be focusing on?
Yeah. So like I was mentioning, this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is so much related to metabolism that depending on where you are, some people even call it metabolic associated liver disease, or MAFLD instead of NAFLD. Depending on where you are, both names are out in circulation. But so these are going to be, things that benefit patients' comorbidities, if they have it, would be part of my dietary recommendations. So just for an overview, fatty liver disease is extremely common. It is, depending on the source. Again, there's no good screening recommendations to screen everybody for this, but probably in about between 20% to 33%, or 1 in 3 adults have fatty liver. Then when we talk about NASH or the progression, it starts to go down. That's only about 5% of the population. But when we talk about someone who has, say, type 2 diabetes, probably about 70% of them have fatty liver disease, patients with type 2 diabetes. That's also higher in patients who are overweight, patients who are bariatric surgery patients. So there's specific populations that are going to be more likely to have fatty liver. And part of the treatment related to nutrition should be targeting that. So if we have a patient that has type 2 diabetes and also has fatty liver, I'm going to talk to them about carbohydrate counting and carbohydrate sources, and making sure that their A1C is within recommended, as well as all these same recommendations I would talk to for anybody. Same with somebody who has high blood pressure and fatty liver disease. I'm going to be talking to them about increasing their potassium, watching sodium in their diet, things like that, as well as the recommendations for fatty liver disease. So it really depends on the comorbidities. But things that we would recommend for anybody would be watching high fructose corn syrup. And again, high fructose corn syrup is everywhere. But fructose in itself isn't bad. Fructose is one of the major sugars in fruit. So when patients are saying, can I ever have fruit again, which happens all the time for patients that go online and see where it says fructose. Yes, you should eat fruit. And fruits and vegetables and natural sources of sugars aren't being demonized here. And even with that, making sure with patients that we're setting goals, if this is somebody who drinks 6 sodas a day, then I might talk to them about, can we drink 1? Starting with realistic goals for the patient. Other things, like I mentioned, coffee is beneficial. And a lot of studies, that was 2 to 3 cups of black coffee a day. Like I mentioned, even carbohydrates, high carbohydrates in the diet and extra high fructose corn syrup can cause our liver to create more fat. So we're really going to try to promote cutting out things like, as much as possible, stopping at Starbucks or using excessive amounts of creamer at home. And we've all been guilty of that, but creamer is delicious. But trying to cut out excessive amounts at home, trying to switch to something like, maybe if you need a creamer, something like 2% milk or something just so your coffee tastes good, because I don't want to ruin that for anybody. Other dietary recommendations other than that mild weight loss and coffee, there are some studies that point out that vitamin E supplementation may be beneficial to prevent the fibrosis. So after we have NASH or after we have inflammation within the liver, preventing further scarring of the liver. Those studies use a lot of vitamin E, so about 400 international units twice a day in most of those studies. Some use 800 units once a day, but that's significantly more than the recommended dietary allowance. So what I typically tell my patients is just to make sure that they have vitamin E rich sources in their diet, which typically is going to be things like nuts, seeds, some plant oils. For patients who can't tolerate nuts and seeds, whether it's for allergies, they don't like it, there are some green leafy vegetables or whole grains that can be a good source of vitamin E as well. If there's patients that you're really concerned about their diet, again, these studies do tend to use supplemental vitamin E. So I will have people pick up a smaller dose of supplemental vitamin E. The thing is with vitamin E is we're not going to be testing patients' lab values to make sure that they're not taking in excess. So that's why I prefer to recommend dietary sources rather than just tell patients, you're going to supplement before they're taking too much. There's definitely too much of a good thing when it comes to these fat-soluble vitamins. The other thing is making sure that patients have realistic expectations, that they're looking at, we all go home and look things up on Google, but that they're looking at well-vetted sources. So a lot of times when patients are diagnosed with any kind of liver disease, that's scary. And I don't want to underscore that. But there's unfortunately a lot of places that want to take advantage of that by selling things like liver cleanses or metabolic support and all these weird herb supplements mixes online. And we really want to discourage that in our patients. We also want to discourage fad diets as much as possible. Yes, fatty liver disease is related to fat in the liver, but that doesn't mean you can't eat fat ever. Again, it's choosing the more unsaturated forms of fat rather than saturated forms. And even then, about 20 grams of saturated fat is okay in a day. I'm never going to say somebody can't have something, but it's all about the portion. And we don't want them to be on a keto diet. We don't want them to be on a low carb diet for no reason. Again, if it's supporting some of these other comorbidities and we have them on a lower carbohydrate diet related to diabetes, that's one thing, but we want to make sure that they're getting adequate nutrition and making sustainable changes.
I'm really glad you touched on kind of the specific diets and those fad diets, because I'm sure people are wondering, okay, well, keto sounds good because it's a low carb diet. So it sounds like for the most general population, if they don't have any comorbidities, it sounds like that they can follow just the general healthy guidelines for Americans. Is that pretty true?
Yeah, truly. I mean, it's very similar that for all of us, we should be watching added sugars and trying to be physically active. And for a lot of us, a modest weight loss of 5 to 10% could be helpful. So exactly, this is not something where I would want patients to go throw out all the food in their fridge and go on a crazy crash diet or anything like that. It really is general healthy lifestyle changes. And for some people, a diagnosis of one of the diseases within the spectrum of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease can just be a way to get them back to focusing on, good nutrition habits.
Okay. You have mentioned saturated fat, and I'm sitting here kind of thinking, As a clinician, should we be encouraging them to lower their total fat intake, or should we be focusing on carbohydrate intake? Because they both do affect fat in the liver. So I'm curious how you would respond to that question.
Yeah, so I tend to focus first on carbohydrates because as far as the recommendations, I want my patients to lose weight. It's really easy to eat a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods. Again, I know I mentioned sugary coffees all the time. That's my advice too sometimes is we have a Starbucks in the hospital, and just making sure that we're limiting carbohydrates, especially sugar-sweetened beverages. It's so easy to get, from the energy drinks to coffee to even the, smoothies at stores that definitely have added sugars and concentrated fruit juices and things in them. It's really easy to get extra calories that way that can make it difficult for patients to achieve that modest weight loss. Then again, our body can use these carbohydrate sources to create fat, which is going to trigger de novo lipogenesis or creation of fat within the liver. Also is going to affect our triglycerides. So I tend to focus on carbohydrate sources first. That definitely is dependent on the patient, but I would say more of my patients have a significant amount of added carbohydrates in their diet. And when I'm talking about carbohydrates as well, making sure that we're talking about, when I say added sugars and, added carbohydrates into the diet, what I mean, I would rather patients choose the whole grain options and fruits and vegetables and things like that. I'm not in any way trying to demonize that. If anything, I want patients to eat more of those foods to help them feel satisfied from the fiber and also just from the increased vitamins and minerals that are lacking in a lot of our diets.
I'm so glad you went there with carbohydrates because that was going to be my follow-up, because I actually hear from patients a lot of clinicians telling them that they need to cut out carbohydrates, and it's either mispresented or misunderstood that now fruits and vegetables are bad and I can't eat any of those, but those aren't the carbohydrates that you're talking about here. Tell us the carbohydrates specifically that patients should be limiting. And right, I love that you said you're not trying to ruin, coffee for anybody. We're not trying to ruin the yummy, sweet, fulfilling, satisfying carbohydrates that are out there, but they need to be limited somewhat, especially if we are progressing through this liver disease. So what are those specific carbohydrates that come to your mind that you would discuss with your patients and say, hey, let's cut back on these ones specifically, but obviously fruits, vegetables, and whole grains are fine?
Yeah, so sugar-sweetened beverages, by far the largest. The other one would be packaged snack products. So things like, the chips, the cookies, and, even some of that does go back to things that are sold in the health aisle, but they're really just refined grains. I would rather patients, start small by switching to something like a whole grain. So if you typically do, I don't know, a cookie pack as your midday snack, switching to something like a oat bar, at least oats are whole grains. Or when I'm talking to patients about carbohydrate sources, things like switching to 100% whole wheat pasta, and then being aware of the serving size rather than doing things like enriched grains. Or also when it comes to the portion size and the carbohydrates, trying as best as possible to eat more at home rather than out at restaurants, just because even if it's at a restaurant and it says, something that sounds great, like now 50% whole grain or something like that, the portion sizes are just really large. And so even when people are trying to make healthier options, if the portion sizes are really large, that can be difficult when it comes to eating less carbohydrates and also this modest weight loss that we keep talking about to make it achievable. And that really starts with, as well, teaching patients to read labels and then what is a whole grain. So we've said whole grains a lot, but I mean things like brown rice and quinoa and things like oatmeal and 100% corn. So I tell patients all the time, popcorn's a whole grain.
Yep.
But explaining what I mean with a whole grain, what makes something a whole grain. It has the germ, endosperm, and bran, and that's why it's more nutritious, is it has all the natural vitamins and fiber and things like that. It helps you feel full. And you mentioned we're both dietitians and physician assistants. I absolutely love it because I do feel like when I'm talking about fatty liver disease, it's almost a flashback. I have my dietitian hat on in a lot of ways because there's a lot of myth busting when it comes to carbs aren't bad, the portion sizes and the amounts and things like that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of patient education that's needed in this because really it's treatable and preventable with dietary changes. So
Mhm.
I love that you've got two hats because it's so fun to be able to pull on and off each hat. So we've talked about carbohydrates. I want to linger here a little bit and talk about fats a little bit more because you have mentioned kind of saturated fats and unsaturated fats and just kind of bring us back to the basics. Obviously, most clinicians will kind of have an understanding that saturated fats are quote unquote bad. Unsaturated fats are good, but I don't love that terminology. So I'd love for you to kind of break that down and explain which one fits into each group and which ones patients can be having.
Yeah. So saturated fats are going to be found primarily in our animal products. So meats, cheeses, dairy, butter, things like that. The reason that people like to label it as bad is that it can increase our LDL or our bad cholesterol, whereas our quote unquote good fats are unsaturated fats. So poly and mono unsaturated fats. On the label, it can be a little confusing because it just says total fat. And then some of it will say total fat and then how much of that is saturated fat. Some of them don't really break down how much is unsaturated, but it would be the remaining from the total that's not saturated. And you're right that they do get demonized. We're all going to eat some saturated fats. There's no, I mean, you could, I guess, eat none, but it's unrealistic if you're eating, just even a well-rounded diet. And while fat in the diet itself is not the driving force of fatty liver disease, when we're talking about fatty liver disease, like you mentioned before, we're talking about healthy lifestyle habits. And so I do like to educate patients on, the different kinds of fat, where they're found and why it's a problem, that this is a metabolic disease. And so, like I said, for patients that have high triglycerides within metabolic syndrome, it's more common to have fatty liver disease. The same thing within metabolic syndrome, patients who have low HDL or good cholesterol are more likely to have these metabolic syndromes. And so with the types of fat, we're hoping to improve their overall health. So unsaturated fats typically are found in any plant foods. The goal isn't just to start drinking olive oil or any seed oil, whether it's avocado, canola, corn oil, all of those would be unsaturated fats. Also nuts, seeds, avocados, all the things that people think of as quote unquote a little healthier. Again, it's not that they're healthier. They just have different kinds of fat in it. The unsaturated fats tend not to raise our bad cholesterol. But when we are talking to patients about these types of fat, making it so we're not demonizing saturated fat, but trying to get patients to be aware of where this is. So with meats, leaner meats, lower in saturated fats, but it comes down to the portion sizes as well. So showing patients what 4 ounces of meat looks like, or 4 ounces of some of these proteins, it's not a lot. And sometimes it's a larger conversation when you're saying, okay, eat less fat. Okay, but where am I going to get my protein? Oh, there's plant-based proteins like nuts and seeds and beans and tofu. And those tend to have less, or if very little saturated fat. So sometimes this can turn into a full-blown nutrition education session, which I would say if clinicians aren't comfortable, that's what dietitians are for, to help with some of these in-depth conversations. But with these different types of fat, helping patients just be informed, teaching them how to read labels, making sure that they understand, like I said, that you're not going to eat zero saturated fat. But where are the major forms of saturated fat in your diet and how this affects your overall health or your overall health goals?
And I love that you mentioned you're not going to completely avoid all saturated fat. Number one, fat makes food taste good. It also helps with satiety as well too. So we're not trying to avoid all of the fat, but I love that you also mentioned trying to not eat out as much because, if you're stopping at Checkers or Burger King or whatever, a fast food restaurant, and just grabbing French fries and a fried chicken sandwich, you probably could choose some healthier options that are not as high in saturated fat than that. So packing your lunch or, just choosing healthier options if you are needing to dine out, I think are really easy steps to take towards decreasing their total intake of saturated fat.
And even just, we were talking about how the liver stores fat soluble vitamins. Yeah, you got to eat some fat to absorb these fat soluble vitamins. But it's just what kind of fat, how often, and the amount.
Yep, that's a great point. So we've talked so much about kind of what patients should focus on, what we should be trying to minimize. Now, besides coffee, my sweet nectar from heaven, are there any other, liver quote unquote superfoods? If somebody Googles this, is this a myth, or are there certain foods that are like really helpful, really beneficial for liver function?
Yeah. So most of them are a myth, unfortunately. Things that we could do to support the liver are, for the most part, general healthy diet. Things that we would want to avoid, like I said, are these weird metabolism medication supplement things that people sell online that are really just a mix of different herbs. Like they'll have adaptogens in it and just a lot of things that the science just isn't there yet to say if it's beneficial or not. But also how supplements in our country are not well regulated. You don't 100% even know what you're getting, even based on what it says on the label. Other things for the liver specifically, limiting alcohol. So even with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a lot of us drink. I live in Wisconsin, so everybody drinks, but it is the amount. So when somebody has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or NASH or anything within that spectrum, I encourage them to drink in moderation. So for women, that would be less than 1 drink a day. For men, less than 2. If they can drink less than that, that would be beneficial as well, just because that is extra work on the liver. And if we're already saying, hey, we have this predisposition towards liver disease, or we already have some inflammation or scarring, depending on where you are in that spectrum, we want to limit the further onslaught there of damage to the liver.
Okay, my last and final question that I'm sure clinicians get all the time. Should patients go on a cleanse to just clean everything out and start fresh?
Absolutely not. But I say it all the time, right? That there's all these like liver, kidney detox cleanses online. Our liver does an amazing job at basically being in charge of our metabolism. The liver does so much. We talked a lot about fat, but the liver does so much when it comes to managing blood sugar and carbohydrates and fat and making sure, that we are filtering out any toxins and things like that. The liver does an amazing job on its own. It does not need any help other than this general, more healthful diet recommendations that we've been discussing, avoiding things that we know are damaging to the liver. If somebody was diagnosed with any kind of liver disease, sometimes it could be beneficial to look through things like different medications that could be more toxic to the liver, like amiodarone, and see if those are medications that we could get rid of. But there's no need to do any kind of at-home cleanse with the ones I see more common are like juices and things like that. No studies to say that drinking juice is gonna fix this. Again, it's a modest weight loss, and it has to be sustainable over time. So even if somebody told me, hey, I lost 5 pounds doing a juice cleanse, I guarantee that's not going to be something that's sustainable long-term, the same way as some of the other changes we've discussed.
Yeah, I find it's an ongoing re-education for patients of the fact that cleanses are not needed and they're usually more harmful than good. I mean, we just talked so much about carbohydrates and high fructose corn syrup. And now if you're going to do a juice cleanse, what's juice? It's just carbohydrates. So you're really not benefiting your liver at all. So I love that you cleared the air on that.
And quality of life. I mean, drinking juice for maybe once would be okay, but for a few days,
no thanks. Nope, I couldn't do it.
Exactly. I don't think I could sign myself up for that. And I mean, when it's something like that where it has limited benefit, there's no reason that our patients should be doing things like that. And they're also expensive. There's enough things to spend money on than these juice cleanses that cost $90 a day, or these supplements and herbs. And again, there's very limited research to suggest that they're beneficial. If anything, they're just predatory for patients that are looking for answers about, whatever liver disease that they've been diagnosed with, or who are just looking for general ways to increase their health. Unfortunately, there's a lot of online about different things you can buy for that just aren't the case.
Yeah, such a good place to close. Thank you so much, Cassidy, for just giving us all this information. This was so helpful, and you really broke it down in such simple terms that all of us can understand, whether you're dietitians or not. So that was really, really helpful. Where can people hang out with you if you're on social media, or just give us some more information about where we can chat with you?
Yeah, so my social media is The Nutrition PA. I had to get that name early, so it's the.nutrition.pa on Facebook and Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for the gift of your time. I can't give this time back to you, but I'm so grateful that you spent it with me. We'd love to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, guys, now it's time for my nutrition notes. So today I actually want to leave you with a quote and how you can help your patients make and maintain their health goals. So in talking about liver disease, if you notice, we didn't tell you to have each patient follow a specific diet. We didn't say intermittent fasting or keto or paleo works the best. We really discussed just general healthy guidelines and guiding patients toward making healthy, sustainable changes over time. I want you to focus on empowering our patients to embrace healthier lifestyles, not necessarily following a strict, restrictive diet. And I love how James Clear, the author of the book Atomic Habits, gives us a framework for creating goals and for maintaining them. He says, whenever you want to change your behavior, you need to simply ask yourself, how can I make it obvious? How can I make it attractive? How can I make it easy? And how can I make it satisfying? So those 4 principles: make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. This is a great principle to follow when you're helping your patients establish their health goals. So make it obvious. I want you to paint a vivid picture from the positive outcomes that the patient can achieve. So they might get increased energy levels or improved mood or reduced risk of chronic disease. By highlighting the obvious advantages, you illuminate the path that they should follow and motivate them to stick to it. Number 2, make it attractive. The patient should find joy in their journey. Explore their passions, hobbies, and interests, and show them how adopting healthier habits can enhance those experiences. Whether it's trying new recipes, engaging in fun exercise activities, or connecting with other communities, making health attractive creates an intrinsic motivation that sustains those efforts. Number 3, make it easy. Simplify the process of adopting those healthy habits. Provide your patient with practical, easy-to-follow guidelines tailored to their lifestyle. Give them accessible resources such as meal plans, exercise routines, and stress reduction techniques to make it effortless for them to incorporate these changes into their daily routines. The easier it is, the more likely they are to stick with it. And lastly, make it satisfying. Celebrate with them. Celebrate those milestones, no matter how small or large that change was. Acknowledge their efforts and achievements to reinforce those positive behaviors. So remember James Clear's 4 principles when helping your patients try to achieve their goals. Ask them, how can we make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying? Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found so much value in today's content and that you learned a lot about liver disease and further educating your patients. If you haven't already, I'd love to connect with you on Instagram. You can find me at Exam Room Nutrition. Just shoot me a message and let me know what your favorite episode has been so far, or if there are any topics that you would like to discuss. And that's it for today, guys. So as always, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time. I'll see you next time.